So we're back after our first very interesting session, which was a keynote, or actually two keynotes. For this session, we're learning what came out of a knowledge development project hosted by Kelly McBride. Now, in a short moment, I'll hand over the word, but first I'll tell you that the way we'll do this is that first Kelly will present, then Frederick will take over again and host a panel before we finish with the Q&A. So if you have any questions or you think of anything important along the way, mark down those questions so you're ready to pose them at the end. And also don't hesitate to use the chat throughout the day. So I'm going to hand over the word to Kelly McBride, who is the Deliberative Democracy Lead at TPX Impact. And she's also been engaged in the Scottish Climate Assembly. Now, Kelly, please take the floor and tell us about the work that you've been doing.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Mark, and hello, everybody. My name is Kelly McBride, as you heard, currently working for TPX Impact and calling in from Edinburgh today. I have done quite a bit of work in Scotland on deliberative and participatory democracy, including, as you heard there, on recent assemblies, including Scotland's Climate Assembly, and more recently working with the Scottish Government, and delighted to be joined by Doreen Grove on the call today, looking at how we could embed the routine use of processes like citizens' assemblies, but of course, participation more broadly. So I was delighted to be invited to work with the Knoca network to co-develop practical guidance for policy officials who are thinking about organising a climate assembly. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today, but of course there's going to be so much more substance in the report and the guidance that's been published that you'll be able to have a look at afterwards. I see that they've all gone up on the website now, which is really great to see. And what we're going to be focusing on when we come to the panel, of course, is how can public bodies adapt to climate assemblies and some of that perspective from policymakers. So just to begin, the guidance we produced certainly came from thinking that there was a need perhaps to focus within kind of institutional settings, within government settings, to think about what might need to be done quite practically on an organisation level to ensure that climate assemblies could have the most impact. So I was delighted to convene a series of workshops between March and April 2022 with input from about 22 people with policy experience across about 12 different countries. And what we've brought together outlines some of the different steps and considerations that as a group, people felt that officials should be taking into account and addressing, with a focus on 5 different stages of the process. We were thinking about the starting point of the assembly, the commissioning of the assembly and setting up of the climate assembly. We're also thinking about what happens as an assembly is running, and then finally when you're responding to recommendations and next step actions. So I've just set out some reflections on that basis. And of course, this is going to complement further guidance that's been produced by Knoca on aspects of commissioning, design, implementation, impact and evaluation of climate assemblies too. This wasn't without its challenge, and of course this work is not without its challenge, so I just want to highlight that at the beginning before I go into all the optimism, which is that the development of this guide, of course, highlighted significant challenges that were going to require some further systematic exploration. So contributors to these workshops broadly reflected things on our current models of governance and policy making, but that perhaps they're not always set up in a way that enables us to fully embrace participatory processes like climate assemblies. So we've got a little bit of thinking still to do. And additionally, we found that governments don't yet have widespread knowledge and skills to know how to make the most of deliberative contributions. And that includes in the analysis of the inputs as they come into the policy process. So there's a bit of a need to more fully investigate how we're doing policy and in ways that effectively integrate, I think, climate assemblies and other forms of deliberation into the way that policy is made. So we understand there's going to be, of course, some different views and different opinions. Some of this is going to be very different in different contexts. So please enter into this with that spirit in mind. So the report, it sets out a series of steps, I would say, that we think that policy officials need to consider as they're going on the journey of developing a climate assembly. To begin with, I'm not going to read through all of the points that appear here, but I'm just going to highlight some of the key things that came through. As we start, we felt it was really important that you understand the problems that you're trying to solve so you can determine whether an assembly is the right approach to begin with. Don't forget there are, of course, lots of other ways that we can do participation and deliberation too. It should be organised, ideally, in connection with wider climate governance, because there's lots of work going on across our governments and across different policy teams that might not always have climate in the title. And it should be building on existing plans to develop new policies and strategies. So you're going to need resources to deliver to ensure that you have what you have available matches your ambition. And we of course know that resource support is quite tricky, and that's going to be very dependent on context too. Continuous engagement with elected representatives, policy officials and other stakeholders came up through all of the different stages of an assembly. And that point, I think, was perhaps reflected earlier, that it's really crucial to keep engaging with elected representatives, with people in different policy teams to ensure buy-in, understanding and support for the process, and to plan those engagements early on to share learning about the process, to clarify questions and misconceptions and start preparing teams to respond to the recommendations, and that people understand their roles and responsibilities within the climate assembly process. Because yeah, we certainly found it's not just about the team delivering, but there's so many connections to be built. On commissioning, we talked about lots of things, of course, but understanding what your mandate is, communicating that really clearly, and developing a very clear remit will absolutely influence every decision that is to follow. So getting that right, making sure the right stakeholders are in the room as you're doing that, felt really important. And you may find it helpful at this stage, I'm sure, to do things like review case studies and meet with peers, which is seems to be building quite a vibrant community, I think, internationally, with peers that have gone through similar processes and been able to have conversations about how things went. Setting up another climate assembly, again, quite a few different steps have been built in here, but we really acknowledge that setting up the process is going to take some time, and it probably isn't best to rush into it. So ensuring that you can develop robust and independent governance arrangements to guide you through is something that would be really good to think of quite early on. And at this point, you should have set your question for the assembly and should be preparing for your external activities. So drawing on advice and developing communication strategies are activities you might be undertaking, and ensuring that you're thinking ahead about the process you're about to deliver to. So, for example, we might want to start thinking now about plans for ongoing opportunities for engagement for assembly participants, which I have seen certainly in my practice. I consider myself a practitioner in the last 18 months or so, has become increasingly important, and we're seeing happen more and more. So processes aren't just ending and people are going on their way, but they're being actively involved in next steps and perhaps advocacy for their recommendations, or at least some engagement with elected officials. Design of the process, we know, usually sometimes starts around the same time, at least commissioning of people that might support the design and facilitation. So ensuring that that work and that connection with design teams and assumptions are being shared about policy processes, how policy is made and how everything connects, feels really important too, because it can't be assumed that designers of processes like this, and indeed facilitators, have deep expertise in the policy-making process on all occasions. So thinking about elements such as the number and shape of recommendations, not as easy as it says when I say it like that, so that what emerges from the process is useful for policy making, and planning ahead for the final reports and getting people involved that are ultimately going to be involved in policy formulation feels like a good thing to do at this point. And then during the assembly, we talked about things like how you can involve people during an assembly in really different ways. We see this quite a lot, organising observer programs, inviting policy officials and elected representatives to observe, but now engage with participants or to hear recommendations directly and perhaps give responses in the room, and things like proactively publishing information about the process so people can follow the work of the assembly feel super important as well. So again, quite a few different things to consider at this stage, but hopefully it will help build a successful process. And then responding to recommendations. Again, it was really highlighted that here we have an opportunity to bring together participants and policy officials, or perhaps even elected officials, to further discuss or interrogate some of those recommendations, and for people that maybe hold some of the decision-making power about the next steps to give feedback and to hear a response from the people that have taken part, so that you can really have an opportunity to understand what participants in these processes said and felt as they were making those recommendations. I'm sure it's no surprise we always recommend that responses are openly published and that details are shared on implementation timelines and challenges where possible. But I think we're certainly seeing across the field a little bit more expertise and experience building up in some of that implementation timeline and challenge reporting. I think it's somewhere where we still have a little bit of work to do. And then monitoring, establishing processes for monitoring and engagement and further communication so people can stay connected and involved. And I personally think, networks we have like the Open Government Network and plans like that are a really great thing that we should maybe be looking to perhaps build commitments to working that way when we deliver deliberative processes. And then finally, we know that we're going to have learned a great deal by the end of the process, and there's going to be some next step actions. So I'm delighted to see that we have research teams that are supporting or coming along the journey of more deliberative processes and climate assemblies. So we're capturing more and more learning, and yeah, really recommend that we set up ways to research and welcome research teams and evaluate along the way so that we can kind of continue learning the lessons and building capacity. So that is a very, very high level introductions to some of the points that have come up in the report. But each of those points that you saw has a connected paragraph as well as suggested steps or actions that you could take to explore that particular thing. So on the right hand side, you see an example of what each of those points looks like in the report. But yes, it's been published now on the Knoca website, so please do go and have a look. It's called Preparing for a Climate Assembly, Guidance for Policy Officials. And I think someone has very helpfully posted a link in the chat. So that's it, I think, for just my brief introduction before we go into our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for this very precise and concise presentation. And it's very interesting to read your report, which you can find on the Knoca website. And now we're just going to move into a panel discussion about these findings. And for that, we've invited 3 people. So the first one is Tim Hughes, who is the Democracy and Participation Lead at the Open Government Partnership. He's a specialist in citizen participation and democracy with over a decade of experience and practice. And prior to joining the Open Government Partnership, he was a director of Involve, who led the UK Climate Assembly. And the second participant in our panel is Doreen Grove, who leads the Scottish Government's involvement in the Open Government Partnership at both the national and international level. And she was also a part of the stewarding group of Scotland's Climate Assembly, which provided guidance and advice on aspects of the Assembly. And last but not least, we have Christoph Konrath, who is the head of department of the Austrian Parliament Directorate. I think maybe that's an okay translation. And thank you, everybody, for joining. It's good to have you here. And I think I'd just like to start this discussion by asking, so from Kelly's presentation, we saw that there were a lot of things going on in leading up to the actual assembly. So a lot of planning in there before you actually start the process. So I was wondering whether you could recognize some of the points that Kelly raised, and if you could say from your own experience with the assemblies you've been working with, what would you highlight as key considerations for public officials or policy officials when planning these type of processes? And maybe we could start with Christoph, and you others could add and chip in as we go along.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Like Doreen and Tim, I took part in this knowledge gathering process. And we found, when we discussed from March to April, we found it extremely important to consider this preparatory phase. And a lot of the experiences that someone writes speaker is muted, but I think you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Actually, we sort of stayed for a long time in the preparatory phase, as we have made the experience that not enough attention was paid to this kind of process stage in the climate assemblies or citizen assemblies that we know of. And when we are confronted within a government organization, or in my case in the parliament, we see that those who should be addressed by such an assembly don't really often know what this assembly is. And although people try to explain like in my case, we are in the research service of the Austrian Parliament. We did a lot of sort of explaining work, but it has to come as well from the assembly, and people have to have a concept of what is going on there. Here, when we meet, we all are very familiar with various new forms of participation. And I think more often than not, we assume that a lot of other people share our knowledge and our familiarity, but in fact, they don't. And therefore, I find this very important, and I support the approach that Kelly took in compiling the report.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Doreen, Tim, do you have anything to add?
I guess for me, the really important thing is the who decides. So it's a really interesting discussion, but before you start a climate assembly, and I think Kelly's work's really highlighted this, you have to be really clear who's making decisions, who is doing the commissioning. Before you even decide what it is you're commissioning, you have to know who it is and who in the end is going to be able to respond and do something with it. What you don't want is to put all of that investment into an assembly and then not have any impact for it. So right at the very beginning, you need to really think who else you need to bring along with you. And I thought our keynote speeches today were both really helpful in that, being thoughtful about who does the commissioning, who's resourcing it, how do you make sure you have independent governance that is sufficiently trusted both by the public but also by politicians for something to happen with the outputs. We have a representative democracy that's taken 300 years to get us where we are. This form of deliberative democracy is relatively new. We need to be testing and being really open and transparent about the things that have worked and the things that haven't, around getting an assembly that is actually going to do the job we want it to do. Climate change affects us all, more than almost anything else in our lives. And we have to make sure that that cross-cutting and connecting right across ministries, right across civil society, so that this isn't something that's seen on the edge as just sort of lobbing the odd stone in, but is core to the way that we're tackling the whole issue of fairness around the changes that are going to be necessary.
Thanks. Tim?
Yeah, so I'll just add that I think the guide is very good, and I think it kind of reflects the balance of actually where the focus needs to be. I think often kind of speaking more as a kind of practitioner of deliberative democracy, we spend a lot of time often talking about the procedures and the processes of the citizen assembly when it's sitting, and kind of, aspects around that. But actually, it's kind of what happens before and after an assembly that is often the really kind of the key phases that kind of underpin whether or not an assembly will be successful or not. And I think what the guidance kind of sets out, particularly in those early phases, that some of the key points around, well, first of all, ensuring that a citizen assembly or climate assembly is the tool that kind of fits the problem you have in the first place is so key. I've had so many conversations with policy officials in the past who've come to me saying, I want to run a citizen assembly on X, and you scratch below the surface a little bit, and it's clear that a citizen assembly is not at all the right kind of method for that particular question. So I think kind of some of those fundamentals are obviously so important. I guess what Christoph was talking about, the engagement that needs to happen before an assembly as well, particularly kind of the engagement around kind of politicians, policy officials, others who need to be brought into the process is really, really important as well. I guess the governance of the process that comes through as well in the guidance of making sure that there's kind of that independent, robust source of expertise to review the process. These are all such kind of critical things that need to be thought of at the beginning. And sadly, I guess often we see with the commissioning of citizen assemblies that that early phase is often rushed. It's there is kind of a political imperative often to get something to meet and to make recommendations quickly. And I think where we see some of the problems with citizen assemblies, and particularly some of the problems later on in the process with recommendations not being taken up, it's because that kind of process at the beginning is squashed and you don't have time to put in place all the things that ensure the impact later on.
Thank you, Tim. All right. So, but as I hear you, I mean, some of the things you're saying actually ties into what Kelly said in the beginning of a presentation, saying that, okay, there's actually no widespread knowledge of how to integrate these climate assemblies into the larger political system. And Christoph, you said that sometimes people think that they have a concept about it, but they actually don't, or let's say somebody does. Okay, so there is actually a person that you've talked to, Tim, and you scratched underneath the surface, and this person actually understood what it meant to have a climate assembly. But now you sort of decided to commission this thing, and I guess you need some kind of coalition building. So you can't be one person in the whole administration wanting to run this thing, right? So there's actually one who knows the concept, but what do you do further down the line? Do you have any advice or any experience with how people could ensure that you're actually preparing this in a way where you activate more people and maybe go coordinate across, because climate is a lot of different things, right? Tim?
Yeah, so I think the skill of running a successful climate assembly or any citizen assembly, or actually any kind of deliberative or participatory process for that matter, is actually bringing together different sources of expertise to kind of inform the process and run the process. So clearly, I guess the design expertise around kind of how to run a successful participatory or deliberative process is one aspect of that. Then on a topic like climate, the expertise around the topic area and kind of I guess the understanding of the topic in a way that it can be then broken down into kind of manageable in a manageable way for citizens is obviously really key as well. But then the two parts that often I think get missed off are the policy expertise and the political expertise as well, which is much more about kind of positioning the assembly within the institution, within the kind of the governance process, and ensuring that is successful. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that you need to leave yourself enough time at the beginning in the early phases to make sure that you can do that engagement within an organization, but also then with others that are external to the organization as well. So other kind of key stakeholders, to make sure that they understand what's happening, understand what their role is in the process, understand how it can solve a problem that they have as well. So it's not something that they're just being asked to support that has kind of no benefit to them, but actually understanding kind of that there will be hopefully a tangible benefit to their job and kind of what their role is as well, and kind of just taking this time to kind of lay that groundwork early on. And it's that engagement that actually often, in terms of the success of an assembly, I think that engagement with stakeholders up front is often more important in the way you do it than actually the engagement of the citizens in the room sometimes at the end of the day.
Interesting. Christoph, you had raised your hand, and then after Doreen wants to say something, I think.
I think what is very important at this stage, and this is something that we discussed in our workshops and that I discussed previously among officials of parliaments in various European countries, is how do we perceive those people who are preparing a climate assembly or who are leading a climate assembly. When they are civil servants, they will often be regarded as sort of civil servants activists. And other people in the administration will ask, or in politics, do they know what their role is? Do they know what they do? Or have they already turned this kind of NGO world? And this may sound maybe ridiculous in the context in that we meet, but actually we all know that public administration can be innovative, but public administration can be also very traditionalist. And people sort of like to stick to their paths. And therefore, it's so important to generate knowledge about what is going on here, what can be done with this, and what are all these kind of methods, because you work in a field where people usually are used to work in a very hierarchical mode, and also they will more often than not, consider party politics in their work. And they will think, how will party politicians react to this? But to make clear that this is different from party politics can be an enormous task. And I just want to recount a thing that happened in the Austrian Climate Assembly, when politicians met the members of the Climate Assembly and said, well, we are not in kindergarten. They replied, we are not either. But what you often find when you work in the administration or with the parliament, that other forms of deliberation, other forms of consultation are sort of, especially when they are assisted by sort of facilitators, so it's seen as something like kindergarten because they need someone to help them. And we don't, we know how to proceed. And I think this is a hugely important thing to, and this is what Kelly points out in her compilation, is that having someone to advise, having someone to facilitate does not mean that this is kindergarten, but this is something that can improve processes. And this is so important to communicate.
Really important point. And Doreen, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess at this kind of early stage, getting that broad buy-in is really important. And one of the things that really matters is where you get your advice from, and as Tim said, where you get the evidence from. And I come back to it, who makes decisions. So the point about civil servants, be they activists or otherwise, naturally I couldn't possibly comment, is a really important one. So making sure that whoever is running this see it as their role to run the assembly in an independent way, and to look for balanced advice and balanced evidence. Otherwise, it will not be credible. So that credibility of the elements that you're putting into it really matters. You need to be really thoughtful about learning styles. So that practice-led assembly is really matters. Having high quality facilitation, having high quality design, having all of those processes set out for people who are paying the bill for this, so they understand why that matters, so that they understand that they have to do something with the outputs from it and feel associated. So in Scotland, we ran a climate assembly with 100 people, and the advisory group had cross-party representation from all the parties in Scottish government, but that was an advisory group, so they weren't in decision-making positions, and I think that is a really helpful balance here, making sure you're connected to decision makers, but they aren't in a position to do the final decision making. And I think the pre-engagement with the population is also important. We did a dialogue, a sort of online engagement with the population. I got about 1,000 comments, and it just gets much more conversation about the issues and about, you know, what you would do with the outputs. They may not feed directly in as kind of evidence, but also that being thoughtful about how you proactively publish all the evidence you do use. So in that beginning period, looking at the setup, making sure you have an independent website that people can then see all the decisions, who took them and why, and all of the evidence that's being presented, so that it becomes a broader conversation than just the 100 people in the room, or in our case, the 100 people online and the 100 children who also ran a parallel inquiry.
Thanks, Doreen, for bringing that up. I just want to ask Kelly, give you an opportunity. Now, if you've been working with this whole project and you only presented it, I'm imagining that you also have some reflections of what we're discussing here. You have your own experiences too that you can draw on.
Yeah, certainly. So I think it's important that we don't forget kind of where we are with this practice of running climate assemblies within governments and institutions. It is quite a new thing still, even though, of course, we have expanding experience in practice of delivering climate assemblies and citizens' assembly more broadly. I think you can learn a lot of lessons, of course, from other forms of participatory and deliberative democracy. So what that means is that within our governments and institutions, we haven't got very sophisticated or developed kind of teams or people with skill sets that are there and ready to respond when the political will says, hey, we're going to go and we're going to do this massive national process. So we're still kind of, you know, figuring that out and kind of like running to catch up, I think, internally. And of course, that matters. That really, really matters, because if you're trying to connect back into policy making, then of course you need people within government institutions that are there to welcome all this stuff with open arms and know what to do with it, really importantly. And the stuff that you get in, to some people, is just going to be like, oh, data that we're going to use to formulate policy that sits alongside all the other stuff in their bucket that's come from their digital consultations and has come from their kind of like market research and like other social research methods. So understanding and developing not just kind of like one team that is practitioners for citizens' assemblies or climate assemblies, but also looking across all the different like skill profiles and roles in government that is involved in the formulation of policy feels really important. So that's why in the report, and why we talked about this in the workshops, that it's not just about the people that like really like to nerd out about deliberative democracy, but it's about kind of socializing deliberative democracy or approaches like this as a way that we can do government. And that is a new way of thinking, and that requires a new way of thinking about what it means, I think personally, to be a civil servant and the kind of skills that might be involved in that, and the spaces that we create for people working in those governments and institutions to learn about things like this and bring them on that journey. And I say learning rather than education very purposefully, because you can sit somewhere and just kind of like, you know, give a presentation, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily understand it or bought into it as a way of working. It requires quite a lot of effort and change, and that needs to come from quite high up, I think, in government. You know, you need that kind of strategic view of this, as well as that kind of what I would call operational and organizational design to make the most of all of this. So yeah, it kind of sounds a little bit bigger when you say it like that, but I think we are getting there, and we're seeing a few examples here and there, but yeah, I'd say that.
All right, thank you very much, Kelly. So there's a cultural aspect to this too, not just the operational. But just before I'm going to address some of the questions in the chat and let people chip in, I just want to ask a last question, which is then more addressed to the operational part, because now we've been talking about the commissioning and the planning, but as you said, Tim, it's both the before and after that are important and that we maybe miss to address sometimes. So I was wondering whether you have some good examples of how you can then ensure this robust uptake or response to the actual processes. Doreen, you were already mentioning it because you think it's a part of the planning. Mm-hmm. Do you have some good experience?
Yeah, I can give you our examples. And I kind of come back to it. This connects with so many bits of policy right across government that there's not one person that will take it forward. So it needs to have buy-in really at all sorts of levels. And that isn't the work of a moment. You really need to bring colleagues along with you. Thinking about what benefit it is for them to have a greater understanding of how the population will respond. So whether it is on the detail of things that they're going to have to put into their own recommendations and policies, or whether it is that broader somebody holding this to account. So in Scotland, we had a very broad set of recommendations. I think That's possibly because it was quite a broad remit for our climate assembly. And if we are learning the lessons, I think we would probably want to hone that down a bit more precisely in future. And again, this is all about the learning, as Kelly says. One of the things we don't have is a consistent way of learning, of sharing the learning. In Scotland, we did research reports for both of our citizen assemblies, and that was enormously helpful. So we learned from our first one, and were much more attentive in our second, the Climate Assembly. We also are trying to work with colleagues in Parliament. So there are now 2 committees in Scottish Parliament that has oversight of citizen participation and the work of open government. So that is a really useful form of oversight, of really somebody asking the question, well, you know, the Citizen Assembly came up with all of these recommendations. What have you done with it? So that oversight really matters. And it means that whoever is running the assembly needs to be able to articulate the benefits and not just say, this is yours, you have to do it. It is bringing people along with you to say, actually, this is a really considered view, and that is helpful for government when they're dealing with something that are really quite difficult, tricky issues. And the population is often, once they understand the implications, is often ahead of where politicians think they are able to be. So I think this is the kind of space and place that we need to be using assemblies, and using not just assemblies, as Tim said. We use the right tool for the right job. That might be citizen juries, it might be people's panels, it might be you know, longer term ways of working, but nonetheless, that deliberative aspect of sharing evidence, understanding each other's views, and making recommendations, it's the deliberation that can really make the difference, I think.
Thank you very much for that elaborate question or answer, I mean. Okay, I really do want to see if there are any questions from the chat so that we can activate some of them. So I want to ask Stine, who's been following the chat, has there been any questions that we should take on?
Yes, there's been one very concrete question from Irvin Meyer in connection to Kelly's presentation. He asked who sets the questions, government, parliament, people in the climate assemblies or outside. So that's one very concrete question. And then Ellie Savage is asking questions also for Kelly. Do you have any specific examples of ongoing opportunities for assembly participants? How do we ensure that decision makers are held to account and participants don't become disillusioned after the assembly? And then also there's been a very long and interesting discussion about the wording when we say and use the word democracy, and does that exclude maybe nations not being a democracy? That's a very large and nuanced discussion that's going on in the chat. So that's some questions to start with.
Thank you, Stine. That's enough to start off with. So Kelly?
I will take the question one first from Owen, I think it was. Yeah, good question on the question. So, you know, the question we would expect to be set up usually during those commissioning or setup stages that were mentioned there, and, you know, benefits of doing it at that stage is that you can involve wider groups of people instead of kind of doing it earlier on and just announcing that you're doing a process. Technically, any of the groups that you mentioned can set the question for an assembly, but the debate is really about the best way to do it and who should be involved to ensure. In this context, don't forget we're talking about a process that's delivered from a government or institutional perspective. Having some kind of connection to policy and the buy-in of the institution and the question that's being set to some extent is really, really helpful. If you were doing it in a different way, perhaps through a public process, of course, if you're doing that as part of something like an embedded assembly process, and that was kind of the process, then, you know, I'm sure you'd have the buy-in to some extent. But if you're civil society, you might run off and do a question that's very different to how it might be set in an institutional setting, because you don't need the buy-in in the same way. So although that's not a very clear and succinct answer, I think it depends. But technically you can do it in any way. And I think that the key thing that we talked about in an institutional setting is ensuring that you at least involve some kind of policy official to some extent in the discussion as you're doing the question setting. And you can do that. And this is what we did in Scotland, actually. You know, I know it was quite a broad question in the end, but the question for the Climate Assembly was set by a half-day workshop bringing together the stewarding group that had civil society, policy and researcher and academic and other representation on it, and started from the point of exploring the issue, which is how it kind of got to this point of it has to include fairness and it has to include effectiveness and it has to have this quite broad focus. So, you know, I think there are different ways to do it involving different actors. You just need to sit and really think about, you know, the best way to do it at those stages that I mentioned. Usually I would advise against, there is one I would advise against, and that is perhaps a surprise announcement from, I don't know, elected officials and decision makers that this is going to be the assembly question without kind of any prior engagement or discussion. And the final thing I would say, and I don't think this is done very much, you can test your question with the public before you certainly set it. And I'd love to be involved in a process that does that. I'm not really actually aware of many examples, but, you know, test your question with stakeholders and members of the public before you finalise it. That is an option. And the second question, sorry, which was on, ongoing participation. Yeah, so I think I said that this is something we're now seeing more and more of, and that, you know, there are different ways again that this can happen. Either the members of an assembly process can self-organise, kind of, you know, set up their own organisations to monitor things. And I think, yeah, one of the most interesting examples of that is certainly the one that happened around the French Climate Assembly. And then in Scotland, this was much more of a process for supporting members after the process that was developed by the Secretariat, so the people that were running the assembly process. So a little bit more of a, I guess, a formal way of doing it to some extent, but the benefits of that was that the members quite early on had an expectation that they would be able to be involved continuously, that they would be able to come together for a meeting after the response from the government had been published to scrutinise that, and then co-develop their own response. And then they were involved in further advocacy work, for lack of a better way of saying it, that involved going to things like parliamentary sessions, putting questions to ministers and elected representatives, continuing engagement with people like the Children's Parliament, who did a parallel process, and then, of course, doing things like speaking to the media. And they had support and training to do that. I know that the point on ongoing support and training, though, is quite an open discussion in the practitioner community about what is kind of the right balance, what might be too much, at what point do you need to maybe let people self-organise and not offer too much support and training, as it were. So yeah, that's a bit of an ongoing discussion. I think there's a bit of space for creativity still there, but we are seeing a few more examples coming, and I'm interested in the moment where it becomes a bit more of an expectation and a norm than something that we're just kind of seeing, you know, a few examples of here and there.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I was wondering if any of you other had anything to add. Is that a hand?
I just add the question, the who decides. I think both the remit and the question. I guess.
Sorry about that.
I'm interested in how we make sure that they actually happen. So while I absolutely agree with Kelly on the process, I think it's really important that either gets into some form of regulation or into legislation, or there is a real substantive commitment around what we're trying to do, because otherwise there is a temptation for it to slip. So I think having the whole point of this coming from a public body means that they will have some way of doing that. And the ideas coming from outside of government are much freer to be able to set whatever question they wish. But then it is much more difficult to make impact and policy change. And I think we've seen that where we've had academic assemblies that haven't had the impact that you would hope they would. So you're always balancing these tensions between the kind of political and government interference and the need for really radical independence in an assembly.
Great point, Doreen. And Christoph, you have a hand raised.
First, I want to support Doreen's point, and I think it's important that, as we said before, citizens' assemblies still needed time to develop and time to be seen to develop. So I do think that we should not just focus on certain details or sort of ideological points who makes the question or so, but often see that there is an interest, there's a question, and we can discuss it. And I know this may be not in line with what a lot of activists think, but here in this paper, it was this government perspective and also this idea of taking government in and so also seeing their role. The other thing, a point that I would like to stress following what Kelly said in her second part, this is something that we also discussed in our workshops, is the different time frames that people experience. When you have a citizen assembly, or in our examples, a climate assembly, then this is they have people and participants and also facilitators and organizers have a very, very dense time frame, and things are done within a rather short period of time and with a kind of urgency. And of course there is urgency, but then you're confronted with the treadmills of the administration of parliaments, who work in completely different, with a completely different conception of time. And I do think that we should pay more attendance to this point, especially because when you've done with a climate assembly, then you expect something to be done with your points. And then it's, I don't know, like take the Austrian example, the climate assembly that is finishing now, that will submit its report on 4th July. And then Parliament will go into recess and will not meet before the 20th of September. And then they will just start to think, oh, which committee could we talk this, which committee could we use? Then they will take some time to find the committee agenda and so on and so on. And it will be past Christmas or past the New Year that they have it in plenary again. But this is completely normal for a parliament. And so sort of to align these time frames and the sense of urgency and what is going on is also an important part, not just of planning, but also of communication, and also how to integrate such an assembly with the workings of government. And I think we should not neglect this point.
Sure, that's a very important operational reflection. And Tim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just perhaps a couple more kind of general overarching points. One, I guess, similar to Christoph, we're still very early, I think, in the process of kind of running citizen assemblies, and kind of, I guess, particularly this question of how they best link with the, I guess, policymaking system, representative system. So I think experimentation is key at this stage, but as long as we're doing that, I guess that experimentation is done in a kind of a deliberate way, and we're learning from it, and all of the points that Doreen made earlier as well around ensuring that we've got proper evaluation in place. I think the other thing just to remember is that democracy and policymaking is inherently a messy process. It will never be kind of a perfect, kind of streamlined process. There will always be challenges of anything kind of feeding into a policymaking process. I think we sometimes fall into the trap of it having much higher expectations for something like a deliberative process than other forms of, I guess, any other kind of engagement or any other kind of input into policy making. And I mean, on the one hand, that's understandable because you're involving citizens, so there's kind of an implicit promise being made there, and it's also a resource-intensive process. I think sometimes we kind of have an expectation that 100% of recommendations are going to be accepted, and when we only get 80%, we're disappointed. And actually, 80% is a pretty good hit rate compared to anything else that's kind of feeding into the policy-making process. So I think that's another thing we need to remember. And I think, I guess, kind of linked to that, you're always working in an imperfect context to some shape or form as well. So I think there's a danger that we can fall into, that we kind of I guess, take the view that it's a science rather than arts, but I think it's probably it's equal parts. So there are certainly some things that we're learning from the evidence, from practice, that definitely needs to be in place. There's also some things that you just need to respond to on a kind of case-by-case contextual basis. You'll have to accept that you're sometimes working in an imperfect scenario, and the key thing is really thinking through actually what is my pathway to impact. Can I see some potential of this having an impact, even if it's not the perfect scenario where politicians have committed to 100% of recommendations or what have you. And that I think gets to that question around democracy and essentially, are we alienating I guess countries that don't have fully fledged representative democracies? But I think that's also true in our own democracies as well. We're all imperfect, and we need these processes can work in lots of different contexts. But the key is thinking very carefully about what is that pathway to impacts, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be through a representative democracy, but you do need to think about whether actually there is a pathway to having impacts.
Cool, thank you very much. I can see that we haven't received any new questions. And it's only 7 minutes left, 7 and 8 minutes left. So I think I just wanted to maybe round off by a last question for you, Kelly, so that you had the chance to start and finalize too. So I was wondering whether you had any reflections on what type of organizational and systemic or systematic changes that we might need to ensure in these political institutions if we want to make the most out of deliberative processes, such as climate assemblies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly something we've been trying to give quite a lot of thought to in Scotland, I think. We've recently published a report on this from a working group. But, building, and I think this builds on the comment I was saying a little bit earlier, the institutional understanding and capacity to handle and commissioning is really important. Knowing how to commission is obviously a skill, and deliver processes like this, as well as work in partnership. So that's very much focused within government and institutions, and you need to have that quite, I think, senior permission, scene setting narrative that feeds into different policy teams and enables people, I think, to work in this kind of way. So there's something there that needs to be done. And again, I'm quite interested in looking at that, of course, from the deliberative and participatory democracy perspective, but it's actually also about culture change and organizational design, as well as it is about this. So I think we need to work as people that are interested in this kind of field in partnership with people that maybe bring that skill set of knowing how to work with and change organizations and support people to develop within them. And then externally, of course, out there in civil society, we have people doing this kind of work all over the place. And sometimes they're not necessarily talking about it in the language of deliberative democracy, but they are the people working, say, as community learning and development workers at the heart of our communities. And there's something about building a space that connects these people, because, one of the challenges we see in Scotland, and interestingly, I hear this in other places, is that we don't feel like we yet have the facilitation capacity to make the most of opportunities for deliberation. So it's not just something that happens one-off, once or twice a year, commissioned by institutions, but it can spread out into our local places, into our neighborhoods, and be done in different ways to develop that supporting narrative for this new form of governance. So there's something that needs to become a supporting democratic infrastructure that enables that to happen, and for people that are interested in working in these ways to know where they can go to get support to maybe develop their learning, their understanding, their skills to deliver these processes, and then at some point connect and dock back into a system where power is held for decision making. So I think it's not just about what we do in government, even though this report and this particular knowledge development process very much focused on that, but actually, also focusing and developing that infrastructure for people more broadly across society to do these kind of processes will also help with that, I think. So it sounds a bit complex when you explain it like that, but I think some of the practical things people have suggested doing is developing things like it sounds quite simple, but I think it's needed, but facilitation programs, developing kind of national participation strategies, perhaps academies, for lack of a better way of saying that, where people can come and learn the skills for things like governance of the future from all sections of society, and can do that in quite a multidisciplinary way. And yeah, I know there's a lot more to it, and I'm sure others will have their view too, but that's kind of where my head is going, and what I'm quite interested in generating a lot more discussion around.
Cool. Thank you for sharing those interesting considerations. And thank you so much to the whole panel, Tim, Doreen, Christoph, Kelly, and thank you, Kelly, for the hard work on the Knowledge Development Project. Before we end, I just want to give the word back to Mark, who's going to give us some practical information, I guess.
I am indeed. So first of all, thank you again, everyone. Kelly for the wonderful work, and Christoph, Doreen, and Tim for taking the time to join us today. And Frederick, once again, a great job done.